July 10th, 1940. RAF Sector Station, Hornchurch, England. The metallic click of the radar receiver cut through the humid air of the operations room as leading aircraftwoman Joan Mitchell leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the phosphorescent screen before her. The greenish glow illuminated her face as she studied a pattern forming along the eastern edge. Not the usual scattered returns from ships in the channel, but something far more ominous. Multiple contacts, bearing 095, range 83 miles, she announced, her voice steady despite the implication of her words. Formation size, extremely large. Wing Commander Thomas Parker leaned over her shoulder, the scent of pipe tobacco and wool uniform mingling with the electrical smell of the equipment. How many? More than I've ever seen, sir. Perhaps hundreds. Parker's face tightened. Raid warning red. Get fighter command on the line. Now! Within minutes, the information travelled through a meticulously designed network of telephone lines, plotting tables and command centres. The strange, otherworldly towers of the chain-home radar system, 360-foot steel behemoths standing silent guard along Britain's coastline, had just given the Royal Air Force a precious 23-minute warning before the Luftwaffe struck. The Battle of Britain had entered its most critical phase, and the fate of the free world hung on a detection system that just 5 years earlier had been nothing more than a theoretical possibility. 60 miles away, in a government laboratory outside London, a 48-year-old Scottish scientist received word of the massive incoming raid. Robert Watson Watt removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The system of radio direction finding, as radar was then called, represented his life's work. The unexpected application of his studies on thunderstorm detection now translated into an invisible shield protecting Britain's airspace. The technical specifications of the chain-home system would have seemed rudimentary by later standards, operating between 20 to 30 MHz, transmitting at 350 kilowatts, with accuracy often measured in miles rather than yards. The displays showed only crude blips without altitude information. The towers themselves, arranged in a network of 21 stations from Southampton to Aberdeen, were vulnerable to bombing and sabotage. And yet, this improvised system was about to prove decisive in the most important air battle in history. Watson Watt turned to his assistant, a young physicist named Robert Hanbury Brown. Any reports of jamming or countermeasures? None yet, sir, came the reply. The Germans still don't seem to understand what they're up against. That misunderstanding would prove fatal to Hitler's invasion plans. While German reconnaissance had observed the distinctive radar towers, they had failed to comprehend their purpose or their revolutionary impact on air defense. The Luftwaffe's tactical advantage in aircraft numbers, nearly 2,600 operational planes against Britain's 640 fighters, was being systematically neutralized by what the Germans called England's magic eye. As Watson Watt waited for reports from the developing battle, he recalled the long journey from theoretical possibility to operational necessity, the skepticism of military planners, the technical challenges that had seemed insurmountable, the cobbled-together experiments that had proven his concept. His unconventional approach, focusing on detection rather than destruction, had transformed air warfare forever. The telephone rang. Fighter Command was reporting successful interceptions. The Hurricanes and Spitfires, guided with unprecedented precision to their targets, were exacting a heavy toll on the German bomber formations. This time the Luftwaffe would lose 16 aircraft, while the RAF would lose just 4, an exchange rate that would eventually prove unsustainable for the Germans. But without those crucial minutes of warning, the outcome would have been dramatically different. Watson Watt's weird trick, turning radio waves into a detection system rather than a destructive beam, was working exactly as he had promised. The shield was holding. October 23rd, 1892, Brechin, Scotland. The cold stone of Brechin's medieval cathedral stood silhouetted against the grey autumn sky as young Robert Watson Watt trudged to school through the narrow streets of the small Scottish town. Born to Patrick Watson Watt, a carpenter and cabinet maker, and Mary Matthew, the boy had already displayed an uncommon curiosity about the natural world. The distant rumble of thunder drew his eyes skyward, a phenomenon that would one day shape not only his life, but the course of history itself. As a descendant of James Watt, the famed Scottish engineer who had perfected the steam engine a century earlier, perhaps it was inevitable that young Robert would gravitate towards scientific pursuits. His early education at Damocrey Primary School and later Brecon High School revealed a mind equally comfortable with mathematics and mechanical tinkering. Teachers noted his tendency to question established wisdom, a trait that would later serve him well when confronting the scientific consensus. By 1912, Watson Watt had enrolled at University College, Dundee, where he studied electrical engineering under Professor William Peddy. The laboratory smelled of hot solder and ozone from electrical discharges, as Watson Watt immersed himself in the cutting-edge physics of the day, particularly the mysterious wireless waves that Marconi had harnessed for communication just a decade earlier. The First World War was approaching, but the young student remained focused on his studies, unaware that the physics he was mastering would one day help determine the outcome of an even greater conflict. After graduating with a BSc in engineering in 1912, Watson Watt joined the Meteorological Office, which was then exploring the relationship between weather patterns and wireless signal propagation. It was here, in a cramped laboratory filled with primitive vacuum tubes and hand-wound coils, that Watson Watt began studying atmospheric disturbances that interfered with early radio transmissions. The crackling static that most engineers considered a nuisance became Watson Watt's obsession. By 1915, he had developed a rudimentary system called direction finding to locate the source of these electromagnetic disturbances. His equipment consisted of a crossed-loop antenna connected to sensitive amplifiers that could determine the direction of incoming radio signals, particularly those generated by lightning strikes up to 2,500 miles away. The meteorological application was clear: tracking approaching thunderstorms to provide early warnings for ships at sea. What appears as interference might actually contain valuable information, Watson Watt noted in a 1916 paper that received little attention outside meteorological circles. The insight reflected his unconventional approach to problems, seeing opportunity where others saw only annoyance. Watson Watt transferred to the Radio Research Station at Slough in 1924, becoming superintendent of the station by 1933. The facility's modest buildings housed increasingly sophisticated equipment for studying the ionosphere, the layer of the atmosphere that reflects radio waves back to Earth. While other scientists focused on improving transmission through the ionosphere, Watson Watt became interested in the reflective properties themselves. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, the political situation in Europe darkened alongside Watson Watt's deepening scientific expertise. The rise of Nazi Germany brought air power to the forefront of military planning. Britain, separated from continental Europe by just 22 miles of English Channel, faced a terrifying vulnerability to air attack. Military planners estimated that German bombers could deliver 600 tons of explosives to London daily, potentially causing 25,000 casualties in the first week alone. In this atmosphere of growing anxiety, the Air Ministry began exploring fantastic schemes for air defence, including an actual death ray that could disable enemy aircraft engines or kill their pilots. The scientific consensus deemed such a weapon impossible with existing technology. But as Watson Watt would soon demonstrate, the impossible sometimes hid in plain sight, disguised as a weird trick of physics that had been overlooked by those seeking more direct solutions. The thunderstorm hunter was about to change the nature of warfare forever. February 26, 1935. Daventry, Northamptonshire, England. A cold wind swept across the muddy field as Robert Watson Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins huddled beside their hastily assembled equipment. Their breaths formed small clouds in the winter air. The setup looked almost comically primitive. A receiver from a BBC radio station, a simple antenna, and an oscilloscope housed in the back of a small van. This makeshift laboratory would soon become the birthplace of a technology that would change warfare forever. Just 3 weeks earlier, Watson Watt had submitted a 3-page memorandum to the Air Ministry. The document, titled Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods, offered an alternative to the impossible death ray that military planners had been seeking. Instead of trying to destroy enemy aircraft with energy beams, Watson Watt proposed something far simpler: using radio waves to detect them. "We cannot kill them, but we might see them," he had written, adding calculations showing that even with existing technology, an airplane's metal body should reflect enough radio energy to be detected from miles away. Most members of the TISAD committee, the group tasked with developing new air defense technologies, remained skeptical. Henry Tizard himself, a prominent chemist and government science advisor, had arranged this demonstration near the BBC's powerful shortwave transmitter at Daventry to settle the matter once and for all. The aircraft should pass overhead in about 5 minutes. AP Rowe, the Air Ministry representative, checked his watch nervously. "If this works, Watson Watt, you'll have your funding." Watson Watt nodded, but kept his eyes fixed on the oscilloscope screen. The equipment was tuned to detect reflections of the BBC's signal at 6 MHz, transmitting at 100 kilowatts. The radio waves spread out in all directions, including upward into the sky. "Aircraft approaching," called the lookout with binoculars. For several tense seconds, nothing changed on the oscilloscope. Then, a small but distinct blip appeared on the screen. As the Hayford bomber flew overhead on its prearranged path, the blip grew stronger, then faded as the aircraft moved away. "There!" Watson Watt shouted, pointing at the screen. "Did you see it?" The Air Ministry officials leaned forward, squinting at the crude equipment. "How far away was that detection?" asked Rowe. "About 8 miles, Watson Watt replied. "With proper equipment, we could extend that to over 100 miles. The officials exchanged glances. What they had just witnessed was not a scientific curiosity, but a potential solution to Britain's most pressing military problem: how to detect enemy bombers early enough to mount an effective defence. Within weeks, Watson Watt received a cheque for $12,500, equivalent to about $850,000 today, to develop a working system. A small team was assembled at Orfordness, a remote spit of land on the Suffolk coast. Working in converted huts with salvaged equipment, the scientists and engineers faced enormous pressure. War clouds were gathering over Europe, and Hitler's Luftwaffe was growing more powerful by the month. The technical challenges seemed overwhelming. The system needed to detect aircraft at least 50 miles away to provide useful warning. It required powerful transmitters, sensitive receivers, and effective ways to display the information. Most critically, it needed to work reliably in all weather conditions, day and night. Watson Watt's leadership style combined scientific precision with practical engineering. "Give them the third best to go on with," he would say, rejecting perfectionism in favour of workable solutions that could be improved later. This approach, unusual in scientific circles, proved perfect for the emergency situation Britain faced. By December 1935, the team had built a system that could reliably detect aircraft at 60 miles, enough to give defending fighters time to scramble. What became known as Chain Home began to take shape. A series of towers along Britain's east and south coasts, each capable of sending radio pulses and detecting their reflections. Watson Watt's weird trick had transformed from theoretical possibility to practical reality in less than a year. The race against time had begun. September 1936 to May 1940, Britain's coastline. The steel lattice of the Chain Home radar towers rose against the skyline like industrial sentinels, 360 feet high and visible for miles. By day, they cast long shadows across the coastal landscape. By night, they stood as silhouettes against the stars. To casual observers, they might have appeared as ordinary radio masts. But to the engineers racing to complete the network before war arrived, they represented Britain's first line of defence against aerial annihilation. The chain home system, taking shape along Britain's east and south coasts, embodied both brilliant innovation and desperate improvisation. Lacking specialized radar components, Watt's team repurposed commercial radio equipment, modified television parts, and even incorporated wooden structures to support the massive antenna arrays. The transmitters operated at the relatively low frequency of 20-30 MHz, chosen not because it was optimal, but because equipment for these frequencies was readily available. Each station consisted of 4 steel towers for transmitting and 4 240-foot wooden towers for receiving. The transmitters pushed out pulses at 350 kilowatts, creating an invisible fan of energy extending outward and upward from the coast. When aircraft entered this electromagnetic field, echoes returned to the receiving antennas, appearing as blips on cathode ray tube displays that revealed both distance and direction. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, the head of Fighter Command, visited the experimental station at Bawdsey Manor in Suffolk during a demonstration in 1937. The reserved, technical-minded commander watched as operators tracked an aircraft more than 80 miles distant, his expression revealing little. But his subsequent actions spoke volumes. Dowding immediately began reorganizing Britain's entire air defense around this new technology. "The issue is not whether the system is perfect," Watt told doubters in the military establishment. "The issue is whether it is useful." This pragmatic approach guided the rapid deployment of stations, even as engineers continued refining the technology. By September 1939, when war finally erupted, 21 chain home stations stood operational, creating a protective electronic screen from Southampton to Aberdeen. July-October 1940. Fighter Command Operations Rooms, Britain. The smell of chalk dust, cigarette smoke, and coffee permeated the underground operations room at RAF Uxbridge as WAF plotters moved coloured markers across the massive table map of southern England. Each marker represented aircraft, blue for friendly, red for hostile, their positions updated every 5 minutes based on radar reports flowing in through a complex network of telephone lines. The women worked with methodical precision, their movements choreographed like dancers, translating electronic pulses into tactical intelligence that would determine the fate of nations. 27 miles away at RAF Duxford, pilots of 12 Group lounged beside their Hurricanes and Spitfires, playing cards and smoking, seemingly relaxed yet coiled with tension. The radar had not yet detected German formations approaching their sector, but the blips on screens to the south showed nearly 300 enemy aircraft crossing the channel, the largest raid yet. The pilots understood what few civilians could grasp. Radar had transformed the fundamental nature of air defense. "Without radar, we'd need 5 times the aircraft we have," squadron leader Douglas Bader remarked to a new pilot. "We'd be flying constant patrols until we ran out of fuel or pilots. With it, we wait until the Germans come to us, then hit them with everything exactly where it hurts most." The statistics told the story more eloquently than any speech. Before radar, defending fighters typically located only 30% of incoming raids. With the chain home system, that figure rose to 85%. Without radar warning, fighters needed 15 minutes to scramble and climb to interception altitude, often too late to prevent bombing. With radar, they received warning 20 to 30 minutes before attackers reached their targets, allowing optimal positioning for ambush. The German Luftwaffe, with 2,600 operational aircraft against Britain's 640 fighters at the battle's start, should have achieved air superiority within weeks. Instead, they found their formations broken up and attacked precisely when most vulnerable. Their fuel supplies running low, their formations disrupted by weather and navigation errors, their bomber crews surprised by fighters appearing seemingly from nowhere. 1945-2000. From war to modern life. In a darkened room aboard a US Navy destroyer ploughing through Pacific waves in April 1945, a young radar operator watched the flickering screen as it painted a picture of approaching Japanese aircraft. The system he monitored bore little resemblance to the primitive chain home stations that had saved Britain. Operating at much higher frequencies, Using a gyrating parabolic dish antenna housed in a distinctive dome, this microwave radar could detect smaller targets at greater ranges with far more precision. The evolution from Watt's original system had been rapid and revolutionary. The wartime development of radar had accelerated at a pace that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. The magnetron, a British invention traded to America in 1940, along with other technological secrets in exchange for industrial support, had enabled the creation of compact, high-frequency radar systems that could be mounted in aircraft, ships, and even submarines. The 10-centimeter wavelength of these systems provided resolution fine enough to detect submarine periscopes breaking the ocean surface or individual vehicles moving on roads. Watt himself had travelled to America in 1941 as part of the British technical mission, helping transfer radar knowledge to US engineers and scientists. His vision had expanded from purely defensive applications to offensive systems that could guide bombers to targets through overcast skies, direct naval gunfire beyond the horizon, and allow night fighters to locate enemy aircraft in total darkness. By war's end, radar had transformed from Watt's weird trick into perhaps the most significant military technology of the conflict after the atomic bomb. British and American factories had produced over 300 distinct radar types for various applications, manufacturing more than 150,000 systems at a cost exceeding $3 billion, more than was spent on the Manhattan Project. Robert Watson Watt received a knighthood in 1942 for his contributions to the war effort, becoming Sir Robert. After the war, he served briefly as Vice Controller of Communications Equipment at the Ministry of Aircraft Production before establishing a private consulting firm in 1952. In a delicious irony, Sir Robert was pulled over for speeding in Canada in 1954 by a police officer using a radar speed gun, a direct descendant of the technology he had pioneered. You may be interested to know that you were caught with an instrument whose development began with your own work on radar, the officer reportedly told him after learning his identity. Yes, and I think I'm being hoisted by my own petard, Watt replied with characteristic good humour. The peaceful applications of radar proliferated in the decades following the war. Air traffic control systems evolved directly from military radar networks, guiding the explosion in commercial aviation. Weather forecasting improved dramatically with Doppler radar systems that could track storm movements and intensities with unprecedented accuracy, fulfilling Watt's original meteorological ambitions on a scale he could never have imagined. Marine navigation, once dependent on lighthouses and stars, became safer and more reliable with radar systems that could penetrate fog and darkness. Geologists discovered that certain radar frequencies could penetrate soil and ice, revealing hidden structures beneath the Earth's surface. Medical researchers adapted radar principles to create ultrasound imaging that could see inside the human body without radiation. By the 1990s, radar technology had become so miniaturized and sophisticated that systems no larger than a shoebox could perform tasks that had once required truck-sized equipment. Police radar guns, satellite altimeters, anti-collision systems in automobiles, and motion detectors in security systems all trace their lineage back to Watt's insight about radio reflections. Sir Robert Watt died on December 5, 1973, at age 81, having lived long enough to see humanity's first steps on the moon, a journey made possible in part by radar altimeters and rendezvous systems derived from his work. His legacy extended far beyond the chain home towers that had long since been dismantled or repurposed. The principle he had demonstrated on that cold February day in 1935, that radio waves could detect distant objects by their reflections, had evolved from defensive necessity to ubiquitous technology. What began as a meteorologist's interest in tracking thunderstorms had transformed warfare, then transportation, then medicine, then countless aspects of modern life. As civilian airliners approach Heathrow Airport today, they are guided by descendants of the system that once tracked Luftwaffe bombers. The technological lineage stretches back to those crude blips on Watt's oscilloscope near Daventry, the moment when one engineer's weird trick turned radio waves into something that could see beyond human vision and ultimately changed the course of history.